Well, I don't think we are at any tipping point. The situation is serious, but not so serious that it should stall the entire recovery altogether. And I say this because if you have seen the GDP numbers, they still look pretty robust. Also, in spite of the fact that we have had two very bad monsoons, in spite of that, the food grain production has not suffered too much. Okay. The third thing that we are seeing is very robust retail demand, and that too on account of the fact that though the rural demand seems to be much more impacted, but urban demand still appears to be quite robust. So these are all good indicators, and one of the reasons for this is that in India people have sort of helped themselves instead of waiting for the organized sector to provide all of the employment. So, you see very many of these little businesses all across tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities of India, even in the rural areas where people are literally putting together businesses to help themselves. And obviously that is all resulting in some kind of economic activity, which is all adding to the GDP in the end. What is a concern is industrial growth. And if you have seen the IIP numbers are really looking very, what should I say, depressed. Yeah, and that is something that we really need to take note of and work on, because what is not happening is capital expenditure.
Okay. So that in fact was my anxiety, because if in the past there was a reluctance to let inefficient units go under and banks kept throwing good money after bad, courtesy the Sikh Industrial Companies Act and BIFR, we now seem to be swinging to the other extreme. The entire emphasis seems to be on recovery of dues and not on trying to sift the wheat from the chaff, so that we are able to preserve assets that ultimately have been created using very precious capital in what is essentially a capital scarce country, so that even as we pursue recovery in willful default cases, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So are we now shooting ourselves in the foot? Because in the final analysis, economic recovery is the best way to resolve NPAs, and we are not going to see recovery, whether it's in industrial growth or elsewhere, unless we address the issue of NPAs sensibly and quickly.
I agree with you in many ways, in the sense that I do believe that we are a very resource-starved nation. Whatever we have created in the form of infrastructure or in the form of core sector, all of these will come in handy as the country grows. In fact, not only that, we will need much more of these, because if you look at any kind of consumption, per capita consumption in India, be it of power or be it of steel, we are still at the very lowest end if you compare the global trends. Therefore, as India grows and as the young population, which is today very aspirational, as they look to fulfilling their aspirations, we will obviously need much more of these. Therefore, it's very essential for us to preserve these units, which today may be seeming to have a lot of debt. But if you look at the replacement cost of the same units, it will be much more than the debt that is owed. Therefore, it is very important for us to try and ensure that these assets get back on the rails.
So what are the weapons that you'd like the government to arm you with? There has been talk of using the NIIF to set up a stressed assets fund, a special situations bank. The bankruptcy code has been passed, and very shortly the government is hoping to pass amendments to 4 other legislations, the SARFAESI Act, the DRT Act, the Stamp Act, the Depositories Act, etc. These are all very well intentioned, but given the ground realities, of which judicial delays and lack of supporting infrastructure are only 2 problems, it will take at the very least at least 2 or 3 years before we see any benefits on the ground. Now, you are a member of the governing council of NIIF, so you know exactly firsthand how difficult it is to have a quick resolution. But do we have the luxury of time? Can we really afford to limp along until these legislations translate into reality on the ground?
No, I don't think we have the luxury of time. And when I said going to war with bare hands, I basically meant that, because it is a fact that the government has actually done a lot, whether it be the Bankruptcy Act, whether it be the amendments to the SARFAESI and the DRT that they have already brought before the Parliament. Yes, a lot has been done. But again, for these to actually get implemented on the ground, there's still going to be some time spent. And in the meanwhile, we will be sitting with all of these accounts that we have classified, many of whom are still working assets. And these assets will face a credit crisis. mainly because it's very difficult for banks to continue to lend to accounts that have been classified. The regulator, mind you, has been insisting that such lending go on. But in actual effect, when you try to do it on the ground, it's very, very difficult because people are scared that, you know, exactly what is being said earlier, that you are throwing good money after bad, may be said here again, especially if some of these assets still go under.
Okay, okay. But actually, if you look at but then Arundhati, one has to think in terms of specific, alternatives, because if you look at the history of banking crises all around the world, and there have been nearly 100 episodes of banking crises in almost as many economies in the world since 1971, and governments have spent an estimated 13% of GDP on an average to clean up their financial systems. But these are merely fiscal costs, and they're not a true measure of the actual damage done to the economy. The real damage is in terms of the loss of output that arises as a consequence. In fact, in 2011, the report of the UK Vickers Commission estimated the median loss of output in terms of a banking crisis at about something like 63%. So, is it not time that we accept that ultimately taxpayer money will have to be spent in whichever way you wish, and the sooner we accept that, it's better. And so ultimately it boils down to finding the resources. There has been a lot of talk of overseas funds, but so far we haven't seen any of them really come in. And the economic survey had talked of using RBI's sizable reserves, but we haven't seen any further discussion on that as well. So should that be an option, because that would give us money without breaching the fiscal deficit, and yet at the same time take care of the lack of resources?
Actually, this is something for the government to decide. I don't really think that I have an opinion on this. I personally believe that the banks have to look at themselves to try and ensure that they do the best they can under the circumstances. So where I am concerned, I am trying to find out those funds that may be willing to come in and work alongside of us. Either it could be a special situation fund that actually takes the assets out of the balance sheets, puts in a credible O&M agency and tries to run them, or it could be another debt fund which could actually do the lending. You know what happens in these companies that are classified? You need them to now start producing or start operating at full capacity in order to be able to repay. Now, in order to be able to ramp up their production to full capacity, they need more working capital. Now, when they approach the banks for the working capital, say 100 crores is required, is supposed to be given by 10 banks. Now, the banks take a lot of time, so these people start getting their working capital in driblets. And that is even worse than not giving them anything, because these driblets are used to service the interest, and the capacity ramp up that is required doesn't happen. So the indebtedness goes up, and yet what you really require in order for this company to pay you back doesn't happen. So we really need funds that will be able to take quick decisions on either giving, say, the last mile funding for completion of projects, or for giving working capital so as to help units ramp up production. So these are the kinds of things that are actually required. Alongside of this, we really hope that we will get in India the presence of some very good ARCs who have done a good job across the globe of turning around stressed assets. And many of these ARCs, they have very good management bandwidth. Our Indian ARCs, I think, they need to step up their game in two ways. One, of course, is where capitalization is concerned. They probably need to get more capital in. And secondly, they need to widen their bandwidth for turnaround cases instead of just looking at stripping and selling. Now, I think these are the sort of areas where we are trying to get into very many conversations with interested people to try to see how much more of this can happen in the economy, so as to start off this entire process. I do believe that once we have 5, 6, 8 good cases, good examples of what turnarounds could look like, then probably others will also get the confidence of coming in. As you were rightly saying, foreign funds, we have been hearing about it, but not much has come in as yet. But I believe that will happen. It is a question of them feeling the comfort that yes, we are serious about it, and they will have the ability to do what it takes in order to get these assets back on the track.
But Ananda, these foreign funds, I don't know, but your faith in them, to my mind, seems a little excessive for the simple reason that they are coming up, going to face the same odds as Indian banks do, whether it is recovery because you come up with judicial delays, whether it comes to working capital finance, the kind of working capital finance that is really required in this country by large corporates. Do you really anticipate funds having that kind of money? I'm really quite doubtful whether they will be able to come into India, work in India, in the same situation that all of you are working, just because they're a little more nimble. I'm not so sure that they'll really have that kind of funds or that they will achieve any better results than banks with their seasoned recovery practices.
No, I think, that's why most of them want to work alongside of a bank. As you've seen, Kotak Mahindra has already set up a fund. I'm sure these people are also having conversations with a lot of other large banking players, because they do realize that this situation is a little different from what they have faced across the globe. And therefore, they understand that they need some local people to handhold them. Also, we are looking at what we can do internally ourselves and get maybe some of the larger PSUs to become the O&M agencies. So there's a lot that we are talking about right now. Unless and until it takes better shape and we are closer to a finality, there's no point talking about these. But the fact remains that I think all of us are quite concentrated in trying and finding out, very focused on trying and finding out some ways of resolving these assets as quickly as possible.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned a specific time frame, and also the fact that you are talking with the regulator. And I know it's a little difficult for a regulated entity to comment on a regulator, but you are the chairman of State Bank of India with a 200-year-old history. So let me ask you a question that I might have hesitated to ask the chairman of a smaller bank. Has the problem really come to a head? Partly because the RBI has not really been as willing as it should have been to sit down with bankers and come up with a via media and have a more realistic timeline for cleaning our balance sheets, whether in terms of provisioning requirements or Basel III requirements, whereas you also said RBI is insisting on Basel III plus standards at the time when banks are already struggling. To give a simple example of RBI's insistence that when a restructuring program fails, banks must make provision from the date of restructuring rather than from the date of the restructuring failed. That is with retrospective effect. Banks have to make provisioning. And this is even though RBI was as much a party to the restructuring as the banks, because it does regular inspections. Its officials are also on the boards of various public sector banks. So the RBI as a banking supervisor also has some responsibility for the failure of restructuring. And that's another reason why I think RBI should share in the pain of NPAs. Unfortunately, while there's a hue and cry when government tries to levy retrospective tax, there's no hue and cry when banks are asked to make retrospective provision. So do you think we should get the RBI to have a little bit more buy-in in the entire issue?
Well, I must say that it is not for lack of consultations. Consultations are very many and at various levels of RBI. But you have to understand, at the end of the day, it is the regulator that will take the call as to how swiftly these things have to be done. I think, there we must give RBI that space, that it is their call as to how quickly the system needs to be cleaned up. Probably the feeling was that the system needs to be cleaned up and provided for enough so that when the growth really comes back in, the banks are already in a good shape. Whether that will happen or not, I still do not know. It is a fact that credit growth at least has still not really kicked off, and that does give us some little space in some way, in the sense that we are not immediately stressed for capital. However, had credit growth come back in, we definitely would have benefited because we would have earned more, which also is an issue, because today the top line itself is not growing, and in fact in the first quarter has shrunk, which is normal. Every year in the first quarter it does go down. So that makes the situation look even worse than what it could possibly have been. But having said that, again, Maithili, we have to understand that the system has to be, that the regulator alone has the macro view of the situation. Even though I am the largest bank, I still don't have that much of a clear understanding as to what exactly is happening in the various other banks. And therefore, it is up to the regulator to decide what should be the timetable.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.